And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight for Losing Our Homes, the Destruction of Community, Culture, and Identity. And hopefully we will also be talking about some things that we can do about that. And thanks to the Middle East Crisis Response, to Jewish Voice for Peace Hudson Valley, to Veterans for Peace New York City, and to Women in Black in New Paltz for coming up with the idea of this panel and putting together the event. So I have a couple of housekeeping details you should be aware of. First of all, we'd like you all to be muted during the presentation so that when your dog starts barking or your neighbor calls you, we don't hear it. And second of all, the event's going to be recorded and it's going to be posted online at a future date. I've already had a couple of requests from people to send them the link for that, so there's some other interest. If you have some questions or observations that you want to make during the event, post them in the chat, because I think that's pretty much how we'll handle questions, although we may open it up at the end. We'll just have to see how our time goes. So that the idea is you put your questions in the chat, and then the speakers will respond to those after they have finished their initial presentations, which will be 10 or 15 minutes each. So that's sort of how we expect this to work. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments ahead of time. So although the displacement of both American families and Palestinian families is happening through different mechanisms, the loss of safety and security of place has many common elements and consequences. In the United States, millions of people are facing the possibility of eviction or foreclosure, while Wall Street, just as it did in 2008's economic collapse, is raising billions of dollars in funds to buy up those homes. And our government is helping them with billions of dollars in subsidies and loans. In Palestine, the history of displacement goes back at least to 1948, when 700 plus villages, Palestinian villages, were destroyed by the Israeli army. It continued with the unabated, really, through the conquest of the West Bank in 1967, what's called the Judaization of Jerusalem, and the creation of hundreds of settlements for Israeli Jews only on Palestinian lands. So while Palestinians are largely forbidden to build, the Israeli government funds and subsidizes these settlements, and it demolishes Palestinian homes. So there's some of the mechanisms. Our speakers tonight are Rashida Tyler, who is the founder of the Real Kingston Tenants Union. She's a board member of Citizens Action New York, and Talal Jabari, who's a Palestinian journalist and documentary filmmaker. Rashida is a longtime tenant organizer, housing advocate, and activist, will speak first. Then she'll hand the mic over to Talal, who began his documentary filmmaking career in East Jerusalem. He's worked on 36 or so films, and his works appeared in Al Jazeera and the New York Times, as well as a number of film festivals, and has won some awards there. We hope you're going to find it really interesting, and we really hope you have lots of questions for the panelists. So thanks, and Rashida, if you would like to begin, then Sharon will spotlight you and you'll take over the view here. Okay, you're on.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Felice. Thank you to Margie. Thank you to Mideast Crisis, Jewish Voices for Peace, and Women in Black New Paltz. Thank you so much for holding this forum. So I'm an advocate. I've been an advocate since I was 7 years old. My mom was a homelessness rights advocate down in New York City. My family is originally, is from Kingston as of the 1930s. And you know, I kind of grew up around activism. And when we were little, we would advocate for, you know, the homeless who were living in the welfare hotels in New York City. So the Prince George, the Martinique, those were the worst of the worst. And that was really where our advocacy was based. My mom was originally involved with the second iteration of the Poor People's Campaign that was being really trying to crack down on the number of homes that they were closing for people with mental disabilities down in New York City. And so 1199 was doing the organizing at that time, and we came north around the same time that that movement was starting to really pick up. So we were still in the activist fight when we moved up to Kingston. We had actually inherited a property from my grandmother, and that enabled us to move to Kingston and have a home. And so it's really kind of, I can relate a lot to the Palestinian experience. And as someone who has experienced homelessness, as someone who has grown up in poverty, you know, to be able to see the mechanisms, the systemic mechanisms at play that keep perpetuating the situation that we have to this present in the housing system. So what are we talking about today about the housing crisis? I mean, I think probably everyone on this call has seen it or heard about it or knows a little bit of that we're in a crisis right now. So I wanted to share some statistics, and I will share my screen here. And they are really just highlighting what's happening today in the Hudson Valley. I'm going to try to get, there we go. So between October 2018 and September of 2019, there were over 1,600 people who experienced or at risk of experiencing homelessness in Ulster County. 31%, or 21,000 Ulster County residents, are renters. And so we needed to have built about 6,600 affordable housing units by 2020. And this is from a report that was written in 2009. So this is the affordability gap. So in order to not have the housing crisis in 2009, we needed to have started building up to the 6,624 unit number. And so right now, we actually have a pretty low vacancy rate of about 2.17% in the city of Kingston. Anything under 5% is considered a housing emergency. It goes into a whole lot about how the vacancy rate is calculated and why we currently don't have the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which would actually trigger rent control. That's a long story. But it suffices to say that Ulster County right now is the 5th highest cost burdened county in the state. So that means 55% of those who rent here pay over 30% of the HUD standard of 30% of their income. So we can see that this is a crisis. And this was before the pandemic. So right now we have a unemployment crisis, and we have a situation where, I will stop sharing my screen for a moment, where things aren't getting better, and that people right now, they have childcare needs, they have the rent was due in March and every month after that. And it's only by the fact that we have had an eviction moratorium between March and June, and then it was extended in June to August, and now it's been extended until the end of the year through a CDC order. But there's some good and bad things to that. So the crisis right now is not over. The crisis is still immediate. It's really just kicking the can down the road, because landlords have also not received any rent during this time period. So the wave of evictions, the tsunami of evictions that was predicted, it is going to come if relief isn't given. Currently, right now, we have a bill that's on the federal level, and that is $100 million within the HEROES Act, and that is supposed to actually help alleviate some of the rent arrears that people are experiencing. There's no telling if we're going to get that before January. So you can see why and where we're at in the crisis. So how did we get here? So the housing crisis in America is not unintentional. It was intentional, and it was intended to impact exactly who it is impacting now. Black and brown people who are on the lower socioeconomic scale. And if we look at our history of redlining, where a red marker was drawn around Black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, and loans were not extended to African Americans who lived in those areas, and there was a subsequent divestment from the areas where those populations lived, you can see that the system of containment was being implemented. And so the policy of containment is something, when we look at Gaza, when we look all the way back even into Germany, what they tried to do with the Jewish people. They tried to contain you in an area. In America, they did it through zoning policies. They did it through funding. In Kingston, if you were African American and you were having to receive DSS or social services or Section 8, you couldn't rent outside of what is known as the Fourth Ward. So that's Midtown Kingston. So you'd have Franklin Street, you know, the central city, the central streets. And that right now is the poorest census tract in the city of Kingston. And that was as a result of the subsequent divestment after the concentration of placing people of color in that area. So what placed people of color in Midtown? Urban renewal. And when we look at urban renewal, in the city of Kingston, we had a pretty vibrant downtown business district. That was the immigrant community. That was where your immigrant European populations, your African Americans, you know, that was the center of where they lived and where they did business. That was bulldozed. I think it was about 88 acres was bulldozed in preparation of receiving highway funds and federal funding. And so that post-war divestment from the city was really moving African Americans into housing projects. So they constructed Broadway East, which is now Springbrook Village. They constructed Roundout Gardens. And this is where families were basically they were herded to. And it was very difficult for them to obtain jobs because of racism that would actually afford them the wages to get out to buy their own properties or to live in a different area. So we can see again through the policy of containment how today's landscape, housing landscape, has been set up. Where I grew up was in the Pankaki section of Kingston. That was where a lot of the African Americans who came up from the South and were migrant workers who worked in the brickyard, they worked in the cement plant, that's where they lived. And my grandmother actually was a nurse, and she started she was the first African American nursing home owner in Ulster County. But that really, it didn't help a lot. It actually made her a target for a lot, for both from white and from Black homeowners and renters in the city. And so when she started out, she was the only African American family in the neighborhood. And then gradually as urban renewal occurred, she actually became, Pankaki became predominantly African American. And today, that area that had been abandoned, because again, there was white flight prior to that, and that is what enabled the neighborhood to become mainly of color. That neighborhood right now, it's located by the river. In fact, this picture is in Pankaki. It's one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Kingston because it's near the river. The item, the river, that was polluted and was the place they shepherded the poor to, where they concentrated the poor, is now a commodity. It's now valued. The beauty that's there, the fact that they cleaned up the pollution, is now something that people who are wealthier are coming in and trying to monopolize and push out the people who have been there through the thick and through the thin. And so again, seeing the policies that have created the inequities that we have has really made me fight, You know, there's things that something can make you or it can break you. So when you're presented with adversity, or when I'm presented with adversity, I try to fight back and rise to the occasion. So when I started the Real Kingston Tenants Union, it was about helping those people who are not being heard. We're led by directly impacted people, and we like to empower those who typically don't get, you know, the call from the politicians or the camera on them. And we try to make sure that, again, first their basic needs are taken care of so that they're able to find an apartment. That right now is probably the most difficult you know, item or thing that we try to do. I've been trying to locate since March or April, an apartment for an elderly gentleman who's 73 years old. He's living in his car, and he's been living in his car since March. You know, it's partly a lot of other things are in his past that prevent him from being able to rent in a traditional location. So in talking to him, talking to other people who are street homeless in Ulster County, I began working with other people in the community on trying to find tangible solutions to the problems that we see, such as homelessness and a lack of affordable housing. So the Ulster County Coalition for Housing Justice was formed, and we have been working since mid-May, late May, to actually create housing. And we have a timeline because winter is approaching. And the pandemic has really forced us to act with speed. Because when it comes to poor people's issues and issues that impact the Black and the Brown community, people tend to take their time. And as you can see, we circle back to the beginning where 2009, we were supposed to build 6,000 units. That was for poor people. That wasn't a priority. That wasn't done. So with this, the artificial, it's not even really artificial. It's a real pressure of trying to get non-congregate housing, so individual housing for people who are experiencing homelessness or cannot find a affordable home by November 15th, which is when the warming centers start to open and people have to be inside, or you know, they will again be at risk of exposure. And so we want to make sure that we have individual housing options and non-congregate housing options by that time. And so the coalition has been working and pressing to make sure that happens. One of the things that we've done is we have designed a petition that has a list of demands. And one of the main demands is that there is funding allotted for and land allotted for a non-congregate housing or temporary housing location or community. So we've been doing a lot of research. I've met with people in Newfield, New York, and they've actually opened a tiny home village. So that's non-congregate housing. It's specifically for homeless veterans, but the tiny home model is actually very, very adaptable to populations in different geographic locations. So if you have an unhoused population in Kingston, that's mainly homeless men, that will be the main population served by that village. If you have a population of seniors in Saugerties or Woodstock, that could be the population of that tiny home village. The model adapts to the location. And so the number we're looking for is small because, again, the need, we hope to actually balance out with the kind of housing ecosystem that we have in Kingston right now. So we hope to have the motels, which are not ideal at all, you know, that some of the people who are living in them, you know, are able to move into temporary or permanent housing. And some of the people who are in the shelter can move into motels, which are more intermediate housing. but people who are immediately homeless, street homeless, will be able to have this non-congregate housing option. And that way it expands, at least even until the spring, the housing stock for those on the lower socioeconomic rung in Ulster County. So I do have a list of our demands, which I wasn't going to read off verbatim, but I think they're important to hear because, you know, as a housing committee, we took some time in coming up with them. And, you know, we wanted to make sure that they are understood and heard by as many people as possible. So we would like, again, an eviction moratorium to be declared until we have an affordable and accessible vaccine for COVID. Again, as I mentioned, even though we have a CDC eviction moratorium, that's just kicking the can down the road, and there's no guarantee that a vaccine will coincide to when that order is over. We would like to cancel all rent and mortgage payments for tenants, small businesses, homeowners experiencing economic hardship until we have an affordable and accessible vaccine for COVID-19. We would like to prevent displacement and quickly rehouse rent-burdened or homeless individuals through legislation and/or supplemental policies. So, such as a residential vacancy tax. So we have people who are second, even third homeowners who just aren't even living in the homes. Another problem in Kingston is that we have a lot of LLCs that have moved in and are retaining the properties for asset value. So they're helping to pad portfolios and they're not being used for their purpose, which is to house people. And then the fourth demand that we have is to require that at least 25% of all housing stock is guaranteed as permanently affordable in Ulster County. In that, I would include that we adopt a universal understood definition of affordable. I was in a meeting the other day, and someone was saying, oh, we're going to allocate money for affordable housing, we're going to do affordable housing. And in the conversation, I had to stop and I said, I don't think we're talking about the same thing. My definition of affordable is that the cashier at Hannaford can afford to live in Kingston and not pay over 30% of her income to rent, that she can live here with her family and have that happen. Because the definition of affordable gets very murky when you deal with people who have never actually had to eke a living by on minimum wage. And so our wages are stagnant and our rents are increasing. And we are being slowly turned here in Ulster County. And that's not the Ulster County that I grew up in. When I grew up, you could afford a good 2-bedroom apartment, $700. You could afford a 1-bedroom, $500. You could afford to live here. Unfortunately, that's not really becoming a reality anymore. So I don't know if I took too long.
Oh, no, you didn't by any means. Thank you so much, Rashida. That was really interesting. I'm getting some requests for people to come in, and I'm trying to text and whatever. But thank you so much. We'll be back for questions, I'm sure. And now I'd like to introduce Talal Jabari. Talal, you are unmuted, and we'll make you the main person, correct?
All right.
There you are. Okay. Thank you.
It's nice to see some familiar names and faces in the crowd. I hope everyone is well. Yeah, thank you, Marjorie and Felice, for the introduction. Thank you, Rashida, for your talk. Very enlightening indeed. And thank you to the sponsors of this event. As with all of the events in this time, you know, everyone wishes we were in person. At least then, you know, maybe we can stare down the people before they check their phones midway through the talk. But c'est la vie, always hoping everyone is well. I guess I'm supposed to talk about displacement. And as I was thinking about this, it took me back to 2001. I was a young journalist, a photojournalist, and I was in the Shafat refugee camp in East Jerusalem, covering my first house demolition. I didn't know what to expect. And I got there, you know, it was a chaotic scene. Riot police on scene, border police, people trying to block the demolition from taking place. And I particularly remember this, you know, this memory is quite vivid for me. And I particularly remember it because at one point I hear a lot of noise coming from one section of the camp, and I run through the alleyways. If you've ever seen Palestinian refugee camps, they can be very tightly knit with a high population density. So I'm running through the alleyway, and I run out onto this street, you know, camera in hand, at the same moment as an Israeli soldier was running from an opposite alleyway, and he met the business end of my lens, and I met the business end of his M16. You know, luckily, by the grace of God, you know, that encounter didn't cause me any pain or inflict any pain on my family. I didn't get the shot because I was scared out of my wits. But I do remember the pain of the three families whose homes had just been destroyed. Their furniture, their photos, everything they owned really, laying, you know, under the rubble of those houses. I particularly remember the rebar sticking out and the kids sifting through what was, you know, a hazardous situation. So a lot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict turns into a historic discussion. And of course, we go back to 1948. I thought Felice was going to give my whole talk to me, and luckily she left some words for me to say. The origin of our displacement story, obviously, where approximately 80% of our people were forced, coerced, or otherwise made to abandon the only homeland known for generations. But, you know, rather than go back in history, which is a very painful history for us and something that we continue to live today, to experience to this day, I want to talk more about very, very recent times, because I think it shows, you know, it's a microcosm of what the Palestinian population has been suffering since 1948, so over the past 72 years. You know, and I want to look at, you know, a few statistics. I won't bog you down with too many numbers, but many of you have probably heard of the Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem. For those who haven't, it's an organization that documents the violations, Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And as a Palestinian, whenever I say West Bank, I'm automatically including East Jerusalem in that category. It has dozens of volunteers who are armed with pens and cameras, and, you know, often at risk to themselves, they go and they document you know, the violations of the occupation in the West Bank, also to some degree in Gaza. According to B'Tselem, this organization that does absolutely great work, last year, and this is how specific I want to get, I'm ignoring 71 years and I'm just going to look at this one. Israeli authorities, or forces, if you will, demolished 275 housing units in the West Bank, again, including East Jerusalem, which caused the displacement of about 750 people, including 350 children. You know, the reason I'm not going to bog you down with statistics is because I get overwhelmed. So let me put it into simpler terms. 275 people approached the Israeli authorities many times, you know, either the Jerusalem municipality or the occupation forces, because they wanted to build homes for themselves or their children. I've got two examples from what you know, my colleagues have covered in the past month alone, so I'm getting even more specific. In the southern part of the West Bank, there's a town called Yatta. And Yatta has a bunch of satellite villages, which some of you might have heard of, like Susia, like Tuwani. You know, these are satellite villages of Yatta. These satellite villages predate the establishment of the State of Israel, and they definitely predate the 1967 war. And as an example, or as proof of this, some are still living in caves. Okay, so I mean, the caves were definitely long before the State of Israel. But this area in particular was designated after the Israeli occupation of 1967 as a firing zone. So it was deemed that Palestinians could not live in this area because it is a firing zone, and demolitions are constant. The Israelis have demolished schools, they've demolished homes, they've demolished stables, and you know, there's a particular school in Susia that they've gone and demolished several times over. You know, we're a stubborn people, and we continue to rebuild. You know, they destroy and we rebuild because we have no other option. This is where we want to live. Our kids need to go to school. Our kids need shelter above their heads. There's this young lady called Asma Nawaja. Her home was destroyed in this area. And she, until this house began to be built, was living with her in-laws since she got married. You know, talk about a rough way to start a marriage. You're stuck in a small house with your in-laws. And this happens to be the poorest, you know, one of the poorest areas in the West Bank. Malnutrition has been documented, you know, throughout these satellite villages. So when I talk about homes in this area, I'm talking about, you know, pretty much a single room, you know, for the two parents and their children. Sometimes the parents' parents are there. So we're talking about 3 generations in this room. So Asma Nawaja and her husband decided they're going to build a cinder block house consisting of 1 room and a bathroom and with a tin roof, which was too much for the Israelis. You know, they had saved up for about 5 years and the house was destroyed within minutes, and they confiscated, you know, a lot of the building materials and a lot of the equipment, a lot of which they had, you know, paid on credit. They had taken a loan to build even this 1 simple room, you know, which by probably, you know, our standards in the US, we wouldn't even consider a house. But these people, you know, it's their home, right? Meanwhile, not too far away, the settlement of Maon, it's in the same area, that apparently has no problem expanding. You know, the firing zone doesn't apply to the Jewish-only settlements. In fact, the majority of the settlements throughout the West Bank, especially over the past few years, have been expanding at an incredible pace. I've been living in the States now for about 5 years. Somewhat displaced myself, but every time I have the good fortune of going back home, you know, hills that were, you know, were green hills that Palestinians obviously were banned from building on, are now, you know, full of settlement buildings, and they're just connecting one to the other It's strangling. But moving along. There's another example I want to give of a gentleman called Hazem Sweti. He owns a piece of land where the separation wall, the apartheid wall, whatever you want to call it, the barrier, happened to be built near. So he owns this land. They come, they build a wall. He tries to get a permit to build for his newlywed son. He gets rejected. He decides he's going to build anyway. There's no room for his son at home. His son needs a home. He saves up about $45,000. Again, you know, a big number. It's a big number here. If I were to, you know, to get $45,000 and set them on fire, but you know, for him, $45,000 he starts to build this house, and before long, it's turned into rubble by Israeli bulldozers. Earlier on in my talk, I mentioned coercion and pressure tactics when it came to the catastrophic displacement of our people in 1948. But these continue today. So we're not just talking about displacement through the demolition of homes. We have severe water limitations. The Israelis control most of our access to water. In the summertime, most people have to pay exorbitant amounts to have it delivered by truck, because you turn on the faucet and nothing's coming out. The Israelis have turned off the switch. Through land confiscation, through not giving permits, through something as disgusting as, now the way the geography is, the West Bank has a lot of hills. The settlers like to build on top of the hills. The Palestinians have their villages, either in the valley or on the side of the hills. Bitar Elite, which is near Bethlehem, which overlooks a very fertile Palestinian agricultural land connected to several Palestinian villages, decides on a very regular basis to just dump their raw sewage onto Palestinian land. In an attempt to kill the agriculture there, in an attempt for people to say, okay, I can't live here anymore. I'm going to leave. The people of those villages that are below Bitar Elite have a court case in the Israeli Supreme Court. Sometimes we as Palestinians get results in the Supreme Court. Many times we don't. It's sort of like, a futile exercise. But the goal of the policy, the goal of the Israeli policy in general, is one. It's maximum amount of land for Israelis, for Jewish Israelis, with the least amount of Palestinians on it. We're allowed to live in the Bantustans that were set up as part of the Oslo Accords, which is known as Area A. But Area C, that covers the vast majority of the West Bank, which is under full Israeli control, is really slated for Palestinian displacement, ethnic cleansing, if you will. In 1948, Ben Gurion started this plan called Plan Dalet, which I won't get into in great detail, but which essentially called for the beginning of the displacement that Felice was talking about, the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and the expulsion of their residents. I believe Plan Dalet continues to this day in Area C. So as I said, we can live in Area A, which is city centers, islands. I don't know if any of you have seen this map. If you type Palestinian archipelago in Google, you'll see a map of what Palestine has become. Someone has redesigned it into looking like islands. And essentially we live on those islands. For the record, I don't place all the blame for the Oslo Accords on the Israelis. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority leadership played an integral role in getting us where we are today. But back to displacement. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're married with children and you live in a place like Silwan. Silwan is a village just on the southern edge of the old city walls. They look right at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The population density is immense there, and you've been saving up for years, decades even, to build your sons a home on land that you own. You pay money for a permit application, but it's denied, like so many other permit applications. You make alterations to the permit, hoping that it will pass. You apply again denied. What can you do, right? What do you have? What recourse do you have? There are almost no apartments to rent in Jerusalem. If a Jerusalemite moves outside of Jerusalem to live in the West Bank, they will revoke his Jerusalem residency, so he can no longer go home. Meanwhile, you own this piece of land. You've saved up this money. So you decide to risk it and build. Now, sometimes I feel, just to be cruel, the Israelis let you finish building it. Sometimes they let you move in, like that example in the Shafat refugee camp where people had moved in with their furniture and with their personal possessions. Then you get a notice posted on your house. It's been slated for demolition. So after you've spent all this money to build this house, after you've spent the money on the permits because they cost money, you retain a lawyer. Okay, so now you're spending more money, essentially money that you really don't have. You petition the courts, so you're paying money to the courts, and perhaps you get an injunction from an Israeli court, maybe even the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, against the demolition. But so many times that doesn't even stop the bulldozers from arriving and executing their inhumane action. People come up to them and they say, look, we have this injunction, it's from an Israeli court. The officer in charge doesn't care and the destruction goes on. It isn't over though. Now, after your house has been destroyed, after you've spent all this money on lawyers and courts and your permits, now you have to pay for the bulldozers that came and demolished your house. Meanwhile, if you do live in Silwan, you could be at risk of losing your home anyway, because some settler group decided that King David used to play whatever version of soccer existed in his time right in your neighborhood. So naturally, that makes it their property, not yours. What I'm talking about here, and the reason I don't go back to 1948, the reason I am sticking to, the past year, the past month, is we're talking about natural expansion, okay? If you, again, when we're done, Google Silwan, S-I-L-W-A-N, Google refugee camps in the West Bank, and look at the photos of how dense these places are, okay? People build upwards if they can, but families grow and children get married and have their own children, and they want to move out and they want to establish their own roots. Meanwhile, the demolitions increase. What has to be one of the most painful statistics for me, and going back to a point that I just made, is that in 2019, 42 people destroyed their own homes so that they wouldn't have to pay for the demolition. Their own homes, their sweat, blood, and tears. Now imagine we're in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic that has everyone, suffering financial impacts, all over the world, the health risks that go along with it, the desire to lock ourselves in our homes and hope that this pandemic, this plague even passes us by. Meanwhile, the Israeli forces have increased the rate at which they're displacing Palestinians through home demolitions in the West Bank, and including, of course, Jerusalem.
So on that grim note, I think, very, very grim, but we also know that the Palestinians, as well as people of color and low-income people, are organizing and resisting and fighting back. And one of the purposes of this event is to talk about also what can we do. And one of the questions that came in, I think, is a good one from Howard, who asks if people are familiar with the Caring Majority, which is a movement that in New York is focusing on higher wages and benefits, especially for home care and essential workers, and universal health care, as well as, defunding the police and reallocating those funds to human needs. And I wanted to talk or ask both of our speakers, especially Rashida, about the movement that goes along with housing justice for better wages, obviously. So I'm going to unmute you, Rashida. You should be unmuted, and maybe you can talk a little bit about healthcare issues and income issues and how they impact housing.
Yeah, definitely, Margie. I'm going to say, first of all, as Talal, as you were speaking, I'm getting angrier and angrier, but it's a good anger, good trouble, as they say. You know, just the parallels between the Palestinian experience and the African American experience. They're tremendous. You know, when you think about the structural racism that has resulted, and I wrote down just some similarities, because in the United States, when we think of like gentrification, that's economic cleansing. But the economic cleansing becomes ethnic cleansing because the people who are on the lower socioeconomic rung tend to be Black and brown. So it's, you know, very constraining factor. And so when we think, I'm going to circle into the question on health inequities, you know, when you are paying over 30% of your income for rent, there are some people actually in Kingston who are paying close to 50% of their incomes for rent. And there was a study from the Fiscal Policy Institute, and it broke it down by race. And it showed that African Americans and people of color, and especially in certain parts of New York, pay over 50% of their income for rent. So of the people who are cost burdened, they tend to be Black and brown. And so when you're cost burdened and when you're trying to pay for a roof over your head, you're not going to be able to afford tutoring. You're not going to be able to afford health care, the co-pays. And likelihood is you're occupying a job where if you have the option of getting a, you know, healthcare plan through the employer, you probably have a pretty high, you know, premium that you have to pay each month, and you might have co-pays. And that's a deterrent for some people to head to the doctor. And then you might end up with healthcare issues. We also tend to link healthcare and housing together because housing is a form of healthcare. If you're sick, where can you recover? Last year, almost 2 years ago, there was a homeless gentleman who was living at the warming center that was at my church. He had been released from the hospital after suffering an aneurysm, a stroke, and a heart attack. And he was homeless. During the time that he was in the hospital, his family had been evicted. He went to DSS, and DSS, you know, said basically he had a sanction on him. They sanctioned him for 90 or 120 days, and he couldn't get assistance. So he couldn't live in the shelter because the shelter requires that you get DSS. So he went to the warming center, and he was recovering there. In the warming center, you have to leave every morning around 9 a.m. Or it could be 7 a.m. and you have to come back in the evening at 7 p.m. But during that span, even if it's winter outside and it's cold, you're out in the street. You know, typically people go to the library or they go to a soup kitchen or something to stay warm. But imagine trying to recover from a heart attack, a brain aneurysm, and a stroke while doing that and looking for an apartment on nothing. So basically, I went to DSS with another person I was working with at the time, and we advocated for him to get that sanction lifted. We were able to get the sanction lifted, and he was able to go into a hotel, which right now, a large percentage of Ulster County's homeless are in motels, and they're being placed in motels as far as Catskill and even Albany, because they're running out of room here. And so, again, trying to recover, trying to get better when you don't have a roof over your head is nearly impossible. So the health outcomes for people who are on the lower socioeconomic scale and who are cost burdened are tremendously are negative. And so the New York State Health Campaign has linked health and housing together. And I think that we have to look at these basic needs. Housing is a human right. You know, if you're saying you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how can you do that if you don't have a place to live?
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Rashida. And Talal, there's another question here for you, which is Rashida talked about the injustice of you know, the treatment of people of color in terms of exploitation and low wages. How does that work for the Palestinians, particularly Palestinian citizens of Israel who face some of the same housing pressures as people do on the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, as I say, it's part of a bigger policy where, you know, constrain Palestinians, whether they're Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinian citizens of the West Bank. You know, especially Gaza, we all know is one open air prison that's extremely constrained. But it's a policy of constraining Palestinians to a very limited, you know, piece of land that, you know, a lot of these lines were drawn in 1948 or 1967, which don't account for population growth, you know, by design, right? I mean, because the idea is that the Palestinians will get tired of this and leave. You know, again, unfortunately, we're very stubborn, and we build and they destroy and we build, because that's who we are, and we believe, you know, that this, you know, that our cause is a just cause, that you know, we've been living on this land for generations, you know, and you know, it's yeah, that's all I can say about it, really.
So I have another question for you, Talal, and after that question, we're going to wrap up with a couple of final asks for both of our speakers. What would they hope that we take away from this? But the question is, Talal, is there any system, legal or otherwise, that is growing that can oppose the Israeli destruction of Palestinian land and homes?
I think, you know, if everyone who's watching this is in the U.S., is American and based in the U.S., the idea isn't what we can do over there. Okay, I mean, people, as I said, they try to petition Israeli courts. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. What we need as Palestinians is more pressure on the U.S. government. You know, hopefully a different U.S. administration that will not, you know, and you know, sadly, this has been, you know, both sides of the aisle are quite strikingly similar in their treatment of Palestinians and turning a blind eye to injustices that we're suffering. And I think, you know, I think we need to write to our congressman, to our senator, and do it over and over and over, and encourage our friends to do it, to the point where they start to understand that, you know, Palestinian lives matter. You know, to steal a term, you know, that we are, you know, our struggle is important as well. You know, that we aren't the occupying force. That we aren't all, you know, the terrorists that Israel wants to portray us as being. You know, 99.9% of us want to just get on with their lives. And even the 0.1%, you know, a lot of them have been forced into what they're doing. So what I, you know, ask, what my people ask for, is that you contact your representatives. You know, this is the most powerful country in the world, and it's a very strong ally of Israel. And we need to, I think, in your correspondence, need to indicate that being pro-Palestinian does not mean anti-Israel. And the Israel lobby has made a very strong play to designate, if you're pro-Palestinian, that's automatically you're anti-Israel. If you're anti-Israel, you're automatically anti-Semitic, and it just, you know, unfolds from there. So I think, you know, Congressman Delgado in my own district is appallingly won't even sign on a bill that would you know, encourage Israelis not to use American money to, you know, incarcerate children. I guess for Antonio Delgado, that's too much. You know, but we need to keep writing to them. We can't give up, right? We need to keep on writing to our representatives and let them know we're pro-Palestinian. It doesn't mean we're anti-Israel. Both can exist together.
Great, thank you. Rashida, do you want to share your asks with us one more time?
Sure. I did see a question on clarifying the demand to cancel back rents. So the demand to cancel rents is so that the tenant doesn't bear that burden. The homeowner who is paying a mortgage doesn't owe that burden. So the bank would have to seek from the state, in the case of a mortgage holder, their funding for the span of time that they were unpaid. And a landlord would have to go to the state and they would have to request that funding. They're actually doing this in Canada right now. And so it means that funding would be allotted, but that the tenant themselves, the homeowner themselves, would not bear that burden. And I think, you know, if we have that, there's nobody who isn't whole. And we can agree that this has been a terrible year and that we shouldn't be weighing down tenants and homeowners and people and small business owners with the need to repay that rent. And so this is part of a petition. So the 4 demands that we have are part of a petition. I don't know if did you want me to read them again, Margie? Or
No, I put the link for the petition in the chat
Awesome.
for everyone, and I'll send it again tomorrow.
Okay. So I did just want to also to clarify some things around when we think of like boycott, divest, you know, the same is true with the police department. And so when we're able to take out funding from things that are harming us, we're able to give funds to things that actually help us as a people to grow. And so it's not so much that we're looking over at, you know, a population or a group, and we say that is the other, the stigmatized other, and we don't want them to have, you know, housing, healthcare. That is prejudiced, it's wrong, and it's something that shouldn't be even in our human vernacular. It shouldn't be within us. That's what I see in the Israeli situation, that they would wait till a person builds a house and then destroys it. Because what's the purpose? The purpose is to try to break the spirit or the soul. In the case and context of the African American experience, it is, you know, definitely keeping a boot literally on someone's neck. And you know, keeping up the pressure and you know, racial violence that's happening here. And it's saying you can only live in these certain neighborhoods. It's redlining. In the Palestinian case, it's literal Bantustans. But that's what we've had in America. And I don't want to take up too much time, but you know, I was taught dependency theory when I was in school, and world systems theory. And we have to look at what is the function of the impoverished area. What is the function of the Bantustan? What is the function of the ghetto? The ghetto is an economic generator. The ghetto provides a lot of income. It provides a lot of funding when you have policing that comes into that area, because you can now prove that you have a census tract that has all this crime and this poverty. But it doesn't help the people that are there.
Right. Well, I want to thank both Talal and Rashida very much for, of course, drawing the comparisons. We know that we're all here because we are concerned about, you know, how can we contribute to the struggles to prevent displacement. These movements are long-term. We've been working on them for how long? You know, for a long time, and we'll continue to work on them. We have no choice because we all do feel that housing is a human right, as is healthcare, as is certainly a living wage, and human dignity has to be honored in these ways. So all of us from JVP and MECR and Women in Black and Veterans for Peace, thank you for joining us tonight. And I very much thank Rashida and Talal for inspiring us to do more, to reach out to our friends, share that petition. If you're interested in volunteering with either JVP or MECR or the Ulster County Coalition for Housing Justice, we welcome volunteers. We have a big lift here, and we need all the help we can get. So thank you all for coming, and have a good night.